So I think that the argument the Pope didn't know is impossible to sustain. Since the First World War and the Lateran Accords, the Vatican had one of the broadest diplomatic network in the world. It was getting direct reports from its agents, from its diplomats, but even from other international diplomats. Brazil actually asks the Vatican to condemn the Holocaust between 1942 and 1943, before Brazil actually declared war on Germany. And, between the 1960s and 1980s, the Vatican actually published 12 collections of documents in which a lot of these reports, growing reports about what's happening in the East, were printed and published. So historians have known about them for a long time. But what the Vatican didn't publish were the side notes and marginalia.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today, Ambrogio A. Caiani, is currently a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Kent, and his upcoming book is Flirting with Evil, the Catholic Church in the Age of Total War and Globalization. I had some technical difficulties, some Wi-Fi issues this morning, which may or may not have been the Catholic Church trying to intervene and keep us from discussing what they were and were not doing during World War II. It's an incredible book, broad in scope. It reminded me of watching The Crown, the series, and that you have this ancient institution trying to cling to survival at all costs throughout the 20th century. And I look forward to discussing it. Thank you, Ambrogio.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on. But unlike the Crown, the church, the British monarchy didn't make such bad friends as the papacy did.
Yes, that's a good place to start. So who were their allies? At least the monarchy knew to get King Edward to abdicate.
Yeah, it's generally presented as a love story, but I guess it was quite a good coincidence that they also got rid of a monarch that happened to have sort of Nazi fascist sympathies, and that the British establishment, at least, has never really gone down that line until recently, I guess, with the resurgence of the reform and restore movements. But Britain has not really had much flirtation with the extreme right. So I think that's one of the major differences.
Yes, let's start at the beginning. A through line in the book is the Vatican's relationship with its neighbor, the Italian state. I didn't realize that the Vatican was beginning the 20th century at a loss, having lost its power. So tell me about the relationship and how it evolved.
Well, it was a very, very traumatic moment for the Vatican because Italy in the 19th century was about a dozen or so states, which one of the northern states conquered. And in order to make Rome the capital of a modern Italian state, they had to come knocking on the Pope's doors, but they came knocking with cannons. And the Pope clearly did not like this. He was eventually constrained to the Vatican, known as the prisoner of the Vatican. The Pope called on all the leaders of the world to refuse to recognize the Italian state. And all but one, refused to do this. But the president of Ecuador, Gabriel Garcia Moreno, actually broke off diplomatic relations with Italy, but he was the only one. But the Vatican felt that it was surrounded by an enemy power, and for the better part of 60 years, it refused to recognize Italy. Popes did not look out on St. Peter's Square. They would be crowned or elected inside, and they were basically known or self-styled themselves as the prisoners in the Vatican. And there were Polish and Irish peasants who had visions of the poor old Pope shackled to a dank cellar or whatever as this prisoner. But no, it was a dispute as the consequence of war that the Catholic Church felt that they were the losers in this struggle of unification, and that they just couldn't accept that they had lost half or most of central Italy to the Italian state. And this led to ever-increasing diplomatic isolation and sidelining of the Vatican. So it starts the 20th century at a disadvantage and very grumpy, I think, is one way of putting it.
Yes. And when did they accept that, no, the Italian state is here to stay?
It took a long time, as I say, if we're being very, very precise, 59 years.
Wow.
And ultimately, I think the 20th century for the Vatican was traumatic because it loses its two big supports, monarchies and aristocracies. After the First World War, they disappear, and the Vatican is desperately looking for new friends. And it doesn't love democracy, too much debate, too much disagreement. Also, in democracies, relationships are horizontal, equal rather than vertical. And therefore, even though there are Catholic parties in democracies, they don't really trust them. They see them as too compromising. So in looking for new friends, they find a very odd one called Benito Mussolini, who wasn't a promising friend. He came from the least religious part of Italy, Emilia-Romagna. He was named after the socialist radical Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez. And initially, Mussolini, when he founds the fascists, it's an anti-clerical movement. They want to confiscate all church land. But when in 1920, Mussolini only gets 3,000 votes, and he's ridiculed by all of the press, he sort of says, maybe in one of the most Catholic countries in the world, attacking the church is not the right idea. Maybe I should try and make peace with it. And after an incredibly long process between when he seizes power in 1922 and 1929, he negotiates what are known as the Lateran Accords. And they are three treaties, one recognizing the sovereignty of the Vatican as an independent state, another giving the Vatican 1.7 billion lira as compensation. That is a real king's ransom. It moves the Vatican from being in a state of constant economic need to an economic powerhouse. If you go to central London today, there's a holding group from Luxembourg called Grolux, which owns, buildings in Sloane Square, in Knightsbridge. Grolux is actually a holding company for the Vatican, and this appears all over the city, and it goes back to the Lateran Accords. And the third treaty was about the relationship between Catholic organizations, priests, bishops, and the fascist state. What was their sphere of influence and what was the state's sphere of influence? So after 59 years, Mussolini succeeds where every other Italian prime minister and politician had failed, to get the Vatican to recognize that Italy exists, and not only that, but is completely surrounding them.
Yes. What did they do with their newfound economic power? They increased their real estate portfolio?
They initially, unluckily for the Vatican, 1929 is not a great year for the stock exchange. As I'm sure you know, it's the Wall Street crash. So initially, they tried to invest it in, American companies, oil companies, various other things. But because of the swings, upwards and downwards, they actually invest a lot in real estate. They move away from blue chips or things that are unstable into real estate. And the really shadowy figure in this is an Italian engineer stroke banker called Agostino Nogara, who's hired by Pope, at this stage, Pius XI, to manage the Vatican's huge portfolio of investments. And the first thing he says is, I noticed that the Pope has recently issued an encyclical, an open letter about social Catholicism and about treating workers and the economy well. Well, I demand that I not be constrained by Catholic ethics in what I invest in. I want to be have a free hand to invest where things are most profitable. So the Vatican's chief banker is not actually investing money according to Catholic ethical teaching.
Speaking of, yes, ethical teaching, I'm interested in discussing the relationship between the church and what became an anti-Semitic catastrophe. You write, the truth was that theological hatred of the Jews created the conditions in which the racial theories of the 20th century could germinate. They were inseparable. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that the Catholic Church does admit to what it has called anti-Judaism. That goes back all the way to St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries, i.e. that the Jews put Christ to death and therefore are guilty of deicide, and therefore they are the enemies of Catholicism, and that where you find them in your domains, you have to create ghettos and keep them separate from your population. The Church, however, says that once a Jewish person converts to Catholicism, they cease to be Jewish, and therefore they're fully accepted into the fold. So that's anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism is a new racial theory that is inspired from the writings of the Baron Gobineau, amongst others, and I think Austen Chamberlain in the UK, that there are higher and lesser races, and that the Jews are a particularly, according to them in this pseudo-scientific theory, are a particularly toxic or untrustworthy race that need to be constrained and constricted and persecuted. And if you take it to its Nazi extreme, exterminated. Now, the argument is that anti-Judaism is not a good thing either, but it's very different from anti-Semitism. I would say that you couldn't have one without the other. The last Jewish ghetto before Hitler reopened them was in Rome. And therefore, there must be some sort of link or interplay between these. Because the Vatican doesn't like anti-Semitism or the new racial thinking of Europe or eugenics or any of that. But it really tears itself up in knots trying to distinguish between good anti-Judaism, which is ridiculous, and bad anti-Semitism. They really get into intellectual acrobatics. For instance, they score an own goal because they could have had an easy win on Good Friday, the day that Christ is alleged by Catholics to have died. There is a Latin prayer for the conversion of the perfidious Jews. I'm quoting them directly. And some Catholics in the 1920s say, this is really insulting. Shouldn't we maybe change this and find a more friendly language? And initially the Pope smiles on this proposal, but then one of the departments in the Vatican that defends orthodoxy says, no, this would be seen as caving in to Jewish demands. We will keep perfidious there. So I think there is a relationship, one can lead to another. And at the very least, if you can't accuse Catholicism of fostering active hatred and persecution of the Jews, I think it definitely breeds indifference and ignorance towards Judaism, which are some of the real preconditions, I guess, for the Holocaust. So I think the Church bears some responsibility in that, but not all.
Yes, you mentioned converts and their rights. I learned from your book the first time the case of Edith Stein and her plea to the Pope was particularly illustrative. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So Edith Stein was an incredibly clever Jewish lady who'd studied, under Herzl, some of the most complex philosophy, phenomenology, and had clearly been looking for a cause or a vision of being useful to humanity. And she eventually converted to Catholicism and became, I think, a Carmelite nun. And in the 1930s, she could see what Hitler was doing. And I think not unreasonably, she wrote to the Pope saying this needs to be condemned. And, we've always had the text of her letter, but we never knew what happened, what the Vatican did. And until recently, when it was discovered by a very good German historian, Hubertus Wolff, we now know that the Vatican basically said, don't reply directly to it, reply to the abbot who has her custody and say that we will pray for her. More or less, nothing came of it. She was basically ignored because the Vatican didn't want to upset its delicate relationship with Hitler by supporting this converted Jewish nun. And to make it further tragic, Edith Stein does manage to escape Germany and ends up in a Dutch convent. But when the Wehrmacht and Nazi forces occupy Holland, She's actually removed from that and will die in a concentration camp. She became a saint under the reign of John Paul II.
Yeah, that's devastating. Another interesting figure, on the flip side, I'd say, is the Bishop of Munster, Clemens August Graf von Galen. Who was he, and what did he accomplish, and what didn't he accomplish?
Now, I think he's a really interesting figure. And I don't know if English listeners know this, but Graf von means count of. So one of the last really aristocratic bishops of the German Reich, a family that had given God knows how many bishops to the German church, fiercely independently minded, and how to put it, he really despised and was skeptical about the Nazis. And during the war, he stops confiscations of church property. He actually physically interposes himself between the Nazi authorities and attempts to confiscate church land. And as he notices that Hitler is upping and accelerating his eugenics program, especially euthanizing people with disabilities or with learning disabilities. I mean, it's a really tragic story. And it's at this time that a particular propaganda film is released. To my shame, I can't quite remember the name, but it's about a wife who gets something like motor neuron disease, and the husband very clemently, according to the Nazis, takes her life. It's a horrendous film. It's really, really terrible propaganda. And Galen, inspired by this, gives a number of sermons against euthanasia, publicly stating his opposition to the Nazis. And what's interesting is that shortly thereafter, and I don't think it's the whole reason, because a lot of Germans came out against the euthanasia program and it was criticized, but von Galen has a major contribution in stopping the program. The Nazis actually desist. In Himmler's diary, he wrote, "After the war, we will hang von Galen from his own steeple." Now, to enter the moral complexity of this, von Galen's bravery in attacking the euthanizing of disabled people is not matched in his defense of the Jewish population under his jurisdiction. He says nothing about the Jews, very sadly. And when it comes to Germany's defeat in the Second World War, he calls for clemency for the Nazi leaders. So it's really difficult to judge. It's really complex at this time to have moral agency. Von Galen does a brilliant job in defending the disabled, less so in defending the Jewish population.
When did the church know about the extent of the persecution of the Jews? And if so, what did they do?
So I think that the argument the Pope didn't know is impossible to sustain. Since the First World War and the Lateran Accords, the Vatican had one of the broadest diplomatic network in the world. It was getting direct reports from its agents, from its diplomats, but even from other international diplomats. Brazil actually asks the Vatican to condemn the Holocaust between 1942 and 1943, before Brazil actually declared war on Germany. And, between the 1960s and 1980s, the Vatican actually published 12 collections of documents in which a lot of these reports, growing reports about what's happening in the East, were printed and published. So historians have known about them for a long time. But what the Vatican didn't publish were the side notes and marginalia. And one of the key figures that has emerged since 2020, when Pope Francis opened the Vatican archives and the Second World War papers, is Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua, who had particular remit for the Jewish population and refugees. And in one report from the Ukrainian Archbishop of Lvov, in which he said, the Jews are really being massacred. There are huge persecutions here, and somebody should say something. Angelo Dell'Acqua writes, well, in a comment on the marginalia to this report, the Jews are known for their proneness to exaggerate, as are Eastern Catholics. I think we should be very careful. And we get this with Angelo Dell'Acqua constantly, underplaying or not taking reports about the persecution of the Jews seriously. Ultimately, he wants to protect at all costs Vatican neutrality and is advising the Pope not to stick his neck out or do much.
Wow. So is it fair to say that the powerful people in the Vatican felt more solidarity with the powerful people in various governments rather than the Eastern Catholics? That power was more important than religion?
I think that's fair, that ultimately the church did not want to expose itself to persecution or criticism on the part of the Nazis. It was really scared of the repercussions. Having said this, and I think we have to be fair, between 1939 and 1940, in the German intelligence service, there was a plot between people like the head of German intelligence, Admiral Canaris, many German generals, and former German Catholic politicians like Müller or Josef Müller, to actually assassinate Hitler and to see what the Allies might be willing to offer for peace. And this conspiracy, so-called Abwehr plot against Hitler, tried to use the Vatican to contact the French and British governments to see if Hitler was assassinated, whether Germany would be allowed to keep Austria and the Sudetenland in a potential peace without Hitler. And the Pope tried, but the British and French foreign ministers didn't believe this offer was reliable or realistic. But at that stage, the Pope was trying his best to undermine Hitler. He clearly changes his mind and thought he'd taken a risk too far. In his Christmas message in 1942, the Pope talks about those who, through no fault of their own, apart from their heritage, he uses the Italian word stirpe, that can be heritage or race, are left to die and waste away through no fault of their own. This is his only public reference to the Holocaust. And you could say that that's not the clearest. And after the war, which is an even bigger mystery, he condemns Nazism, but he never mentions the Holocaust. He's very, very shy or reticent. And we can speculate as to why that might be. But it's horrific that even after the war, when there's no danger of persecution for the church or whatever, he doesn't really condemn it.
But they condemn death penalties for war criminals, correct? That's when they stick their neck out.
Yeah, I mean, this in particular is research being carried out at the moment because we didn't quite realize what the role the Vatican played at Nuremberg. There's been a recent film with Russell Crowe on Goering and the Nuremberg trial, and it makes it seem as if the Vatican was entirely against the trials. That's 50-50 sort of percent true, in the sense that the Vatican actually provides a lot of the paperwork for American and English prosecutors. But Hans Frank, the governor of Poland, known as the Butcher of Poland, responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, converts to Catholicism during the Nuremberg trials. And the church says, couldn't we show mercy to somebody who clearly is really sorry for what he did? And I wish that the Catholic Church would show such clemency towards a lot of other people who it condemns to eternal damnation, whereas Hans Frank and also a lot of German bishops say, well, do we want victor's justice? The Pope himself doesn't actually agree with the unconditional surrender of Germany. He says this will cause problems in future. It'll cause a sense of revenge and frustration. He just doesn't seem to understand that you're not dealing with an ordinary regime, that you can't really negotiate with Nazi Germany. It has to be destroyed as a regime.
How did they try to rebuild their moral standing? Or was it not seen as a moral failure?
It's quite interesting that at the time, it's not really seen as a moral failure, and the church gets away with a lot of ambiguity. because, in 1999, you have that book by Bernard Cornwell about the Pope of the Second World War, Pius XII, called Hitler's Pope. It's a brilliant title, but even the content doesn't really believe that. It talks more about the failure to condemn rather than collaborating with Hitler. Now, previously, the Vatican had said that, hundreds of thousands of Jews are saved during the Second World War thanks to the Pope. Now, I think it's equally true that a very large number of Catholics are rescuers. Across all of Europe, you can find countless evidence of this. Archbishop Saliège of Toulouse in France, Angelo Roncalli, future Pope John XXIII from Ankara, giving Palestinian exit visas for Jews in Hungary. Archbishop Burzio in Bratislava also doing all of this. So huge numbers of Catholics, nuns also in convents hiding lots of Jews. On the other side, you have people like Joseph Tiso and quite a large number of Croatians who are actually collaborating with the Holocaust and helping out. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do a cost-benefit analysis. What I think is the key problem is that the Pope, or at least we've not found any evidence that he ever gave orders for people to save Jews. Mm. Now, this is really complicated because in the 1960s and 1970s, when the Catholic Church started proceedings to make Pius XII a saint, it interviewed a lot of people who were still alive and remembered him. And in these interviews, they said, well, you saved a lot of Jews. Did the Pope informally sort of nod, wink, wink, sort of tell you to do this? And of course, they said yes. But we have no contemporary evidence from the 1940s of this. Actually, we have an order from the Vatican when it was surrounded actually by the Nazis in 1943 by German army of invasion and occupation, that they actually ordered the governor of the Vatican city-state that all Jews in Vatican property be evicted. So I think part of the problem is lots of Catholics help Jews. Pius XII probably did very little, unfortunately, personally.
Yes, it's interesting. I feel like it's a phenomenon we're seeing today. Like, look to the everyday people who are doing the helping. We might not get the leadership or the courage from the top.
I couldn't agree more. I think that communities tend to be, and especially religious communities, tend to be great and show great solidarity. When you get to money and power higher up religious hierarchies, that's when the problems and the rot sets in, so to speak. And I think the Vatican is no different.
To go back in time a little bit, you mentioned exit visas to Palestine. I talk a lot about Zionism in Israel on this podcast. Tell us about Theodore Herzl's audience with the Pope in 1904. He met the man himself.
Yeah, he was going on, trying to think, on a charm offensive. And, the German Kaiser was particularly taken with the idea of a Jewish state. In Britain, he had lots of takers. But, of course, he was met very politely by the then Pope Pius X. They all seem to be pious in the early 20th century, lack of imagination, I guess. And he listened to him, but he said, this is a Christian Holy Land. We can't have Jews in Palestine. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, who he met afterwards, who was renowned for not having a great sense of humor, he said, doesn't somebody else live there already?
Oh,
was his joke. So Herzl didn't get much support or much interest in Italy, but he definitely met with the Pope. But it has to be said that the Vatican and the State of Israel have not had good relations. It's only in the 1990s that the Vatican recognizes the existence of Israel.
Was there an episode that led them to do so, or is it the same as them accepting the state of Italy, that they're like, okay, I guess it's not going anywhere?
I think it was somebody or a change in leadership. John Paul II, the first Polish or non-Italian pope in 300 or 400 years, had lived and seen the Holocaust. Primary school friends of his had died in the camps. And therefore, he understood the legacy of the Second World War and the need to have and cement good Christian-Jewish relations. And I think he was very keen that there be good relations with Israel and normalized relations. Mind you, at the time, in the 1990s, we were quite close to the Oslo Accords, and one of the saddest moments in, I think, the history of the Middle East, so close to peace, and yet it all broke down, that there were plans that the Vatican would have normal relations with both Israel and the Palestinian state. But sadly, the Palestinian side of proceedings didn't come to fruition. But I also think that there was lingering until the 1960s indifference or anti-Judaism, which prevented the Vatican from respecting or understanding the state of Israel.
What is the current relationship? We talk about how the Vatican turned a blind eye to atrocities. Is that still the case?
I think the current Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Cardinal Pizzaballa, has been wonderful in condemning events in Gaza. I think the Vatican is careful in its language, that it condemns murder, bloodshed, and it makes it quite clear that it is against all violence perpetrated in the name of God or secular objectives. But it keeps the lines of communication open with Netanyahu and his government. It tries not to, close the lines of communication. In the same way as over the Ukraine, it's been playing a delicate game of neutrality. It's not condemned Putin or Russia, but at the same time it condemns war. In general, the Vatican condemns war, but tries to communicate with both sides because it wants to act often as an intermediary. It was only with President Trump that the Vatican would meet its match, that Trump would take offense even at the mere mention of anti-war. It takes quite a special character to, most people talk about just and unjust wars. Trump felt that pacifism on the Vatican's part was too much.
And yes, so what is the significance at this juncture in history that we have an American Pope?
It's a wonderful surprise. People said it would never happen because all the other cardinals would be too worried because America or North American Catholicism gives so much money to the Catholic Church. And in the 20th century, sorry for the vulgar language, but the US was the cash cow for the Vatican. Cardinal Spellman in New York, they really adored him because he would come with the big checks. Not only that, but also Cadillacs for the Pope, who loved the motoring and the new technology coming out. So good relations with the US were always important, but everybody else was always jealous of the Americans, and people always thought, we're never going to have an American Pope or else America will be too powerful. I think Prevost, Pope Leo XIV, is an odd sort of American. Grew up in, the south side of Chicago, where there's been a huge collapse in Catholicism, but then spent most of his adult life in Peru. He's also a Peruvian citizen. Therefore, he's a pope that understands the Americas and not just the United States. And I think his missionary quality, his hands-on approach, and his understanding of both sides of the continent, where numbers are growing, and the north, where numbers are falling. The church where he worshipped as a child was sold and lies derelict, so he understands the problems of today. He's also a member of something called the Augustinian Order, and St. Augustine was one of the first people to come up with just and unjust war theory. And what I love is that both J.D. Vance and Trump have been explaining just war theory to one of the guys who's one of the key interpreters of it, really condescending to a pope who's one of the great experts in the matter. But I think he's been right that, peace has to start somewhere, that war rarely gets the results it wants. I mean, I think the Iranian situation has been deeply counterproductive because aerial bombardment rarely leads to revolution. It just leads to more resentment against those who are dropping the bombs. And the Pope has said this, ultimately. That doesn't mean he's pro-Iranian or pro the religious regime on the other side. It just means he's reasonably sort of worrying about the poor people who are being bombarded. But it seems that that's too much for the current president.
Is it fair to say that the conclave electing an American pope means that America as a political institution is in decline if they weren't afraid of it being all too powerful?
A lot of people have said this. To be honest with you, it's quite difficult to disentangle the two things in the sense that America represents the West, and I'm pretty sure that if we look at Europe and America, New Zealand, Australia, what have been traditionally the allies of the sort of Second World War or Cold War, that outside of the US, those powers are definitely in decline and that our economic models are suffering a lot of turbulence, and that the competition coming from, China, India, Brazil is showing that we are under a lot of difficulty. Yet I would say the economic indicators for the US don't quite show the decline to be as bad as in, Canada, Europe, or elsewhere. So maybe the US is not, but it certainly speaks, I think, to the fact that Prevost is a very special kind of American. And also, what I think is amazing is he's also the first pope with a bachelor's of science. He's a mathematician. I think it's not been since the 17th century that we've had a scientific pope. And I think the fact that he's immediately talked about AI and the dangers of exploitation and the misuse of individuals is very, very heartening. I'm quite positive about the last two popes in comparison to the predecessors. Also, I don't know if I'm correct in saying this. I think he's also the first American to become a monarch.
Oh, yeah. Unless, I was about to say Meghan Markle's closest.
Yeah, reigning monarch.
Yes.
So, yeah, he's a very interesting figure.
Who are some other saints that were canonized having lived in the 20th century? We talked about Edith Stein. Are there any other saints you'd like to highlight?
Well, the one I find most troubling and most beautiful in some ways is Maximilian Kolbe. I think this is very difficult to forget him. Polish intellectual missionary, spent a lot of time in Japan, is back in Poland with his Franciscan friars. He's sympathetic to Polish nationalism, so he's rounded up by the Germans fairly early on in the war and ends up in Auschwitz with other Polish resistors. And one day in, I think it's 1941, some prisoners attempt or manage to escape, and as a reprisal, 10 people will be selected at random. And the camp commandant is going around selecting at random the 10 people. And one of the men selected cries, "I will never see my wife and family again." And suddenly a man in glasses stands forth and says, "May I speak?" And the camp commandant oddly says, "Yes, what do you want?" "I would like to volunteer to take this man's place." Kolbe had never met this man before. That was Maximilian Kolbe, the priest. And he accepts to be sent into one of the camp structures, and they're locked in without food and water, and they die a slow, grueling death for 3 weeks. But Maximilian Kolbe apparently led them in prayers and hymns until he was one of the last voices to disappear. And I can't speak highly enough of him. And he was canonized under John Paul II's reign. Now, again, these things are complicated because in the 1920s and early 30s, he talked about a Bolshevik Jewish conspiracy. So human beings who do a lot of good, I mean, I don't know if I would be able to give up my life for a stranger. But at the same time, he had his prejudices against Jewish influences. But I think he's a remarkable saint to give up your own life for a stranger. It's truly the story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible. So there are some wonderful people. I didn't really mention her in the book, but Saint Teresa of Lisieux, an unknown saint in a convent in Normandy, who became a saint because we found her diaries. And it's all about the little things in life, not big theological things, but being kind to her sisters, thinking optimistically and positively, but also as she's coming to die, she dies quite young. I suspect she's got tuberculosis or something like that. She has a lot of doubts about God and its existence. She then, at the very end, comes back to belief, but I think she's fascinating psychologically. So there are, how to put it, there's a lot of negative stuff in the church's relationship to the Second World War, but there is also some positive take-homes, thankfully, from the behavior of some Catholics in the 20th century.
Yes. You write throughout the book of the human psyche's need for comfort and hope in an age of despair. What are some of the most interesting ways people did seek out comfort and hope throughout the 20th century?
I think that something that's happened, maybe started in the 19th century, but has been accelerated even more so, in the 20th, and maybe even more so now with COVID and AI and the digital age, is that we are being isolated. Increasingly becoming individuals is an incredibly lonely and dispiriting act. I mean, I've noticed that there's something which we at university call the COVID generation. Teenagers that have been too long in their head, that haven't had social interaction. And I think the psychological effects of this can be very scary. I think what religion, and, I'm biased, I'm a liberal Catholic, what it can definitely give is a sense of community, to rebuild solidarity, that if you need help, there are people out there, that if you need to talk to somebody, meet somebody, we are social animals, we're out there. And that's why I think that the Catholic Church's proper understanding of AI can be useful, incidentally, but it can also be a great challenge and a danger. I think the Church can be really good in that, in giving us comfort and hope. And also, it depends on how this is used, but it's also comforting to know that there might be the hope of something better eventually. And I take immense comfort in that.
Yes, thank you. As we wind down, I want to talk about Pius XI's first encyclical from October 1939, because it really resonates today. What is worship of the state, and are we seeing that today?
That is one of the great condemnations that appears in a number of encyclicals from his predecessor until that citation you have. Ultimately, and this is one of the things that I think Catholicism has always opposed very much, that ultimately the individual doesn't matter. It's the collective that's the most important thing. In the pursuit of totalitarian ideals, whether they be fascist or communist, the individual is expendable in the search of that utopia. Whereas something that John Paul II called personalism, that our lives are worthwhile not because of what we do or what we achieve, but because we're alive and we're human beings, is a great corrective to that. And I do worry nowadays that we are looking at a sense that the state, your community, your identity is the most important thing rather than our common humanity is a bit worrying. And I think that the idea that because technically, and Jews and Muslims believe this as well, because we're made in the image of God, we're all equal and we all deserve equal dignity and equal rights because our Creator made us this way, is an important corrective to worship of the state or this frenzy of waving flags, saying we're better than this group or that group. I think Catholicism has and many other religions have a role to play in reminding us that we're not American, we're not British, we're not Italian, we're not Ugandan or whatever nationality have you. We're human beings.
Exactly. We can keep the flag waving to the World Cup, which if you're a football fan, I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm still rooting for you guys on Saturday.
Hopefully we can get some minor compensation, but France is going to be tough.
Yes. Yeah, luckily It's times like these, losing in the semifinals, where you like to think that there are better days ahead. There is the world to come, maybe.
Yeah, who knows? But I think the British, and I'm Italian by birth, so I have mixed loyalties here. The British invented football, but sadly, they never seem to be able to win the World Cup.
That's a conversation for a different podcast. Yeah, when you're up 1-0, that's not the time to retreat. I'm sorry. And thank you so much. Where can people find your work? Where can they order the book? When is it coming out?
So, Flirting with Evil is already out in the UK, and the Kindle version is already out in the US. I gathered that there's a shipping container full of them heading towards your eastern seaboard, and Flirting with Evil will be on sale in all good bookshops in America from the 6th of October onwards.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and wishing you best of luck on Saturday.
Thank you so much, Orli, and thank you so much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.